Alright guys, if you're here, you're probably actually interested in how to make sauerkraut. I'm kind of disappointed with how short these short videos are. I can't include any helpful information. So what we're going to do here is, while I mash my sauerkraut and pack it into the jar, I'm just going to talk about what's so great about sauerkraut and kind of deep dive into it. So I wanted to make just a few videos about these living foods because I think it's interesting how these foods that are actually alive are so good for us. And I'm sure most of us have heard by now about all the gut bacteria stuff and how, we have bacteria in our gut and it actually affects us more than you'd think, even down to like your mental health and that kind of thing. So let's just talk about why sauerkraut is made the way it is and like what even is going on with that. So we're adding this 2% of salt by weight to the sauerkraut, and that is actually to preserve it. What you're doing when you add the salt is you're making an environment that not all types of bacteria can survive in. But the lactic acid bacteria that we want in the sauerkraut can survive in that salt solution. It doesn't necessarily need it, but it can survive it. And the other great thing about the salt is that it draws out the liquids from inside of the vegetable, draws them out so that we can use that to submerge the vegetables in liquid. And having the vegetables submerged creates an anaerobic environment where they don't have access to oxygen. This is another way of preserving it because the lactic acid bacteria can survive in the anaerobic environment, but other types of bacteria and mold can't survive in the anaerobic environment. So as long as all your sauerkraut is submerged under the liquid, then you're good to go. So I really like this masher. It's pretty helpful for squishing everything up, but it's also helpful to kind of just like take some handfuls of it and mash it up. It's a good grip strength workout, and I can feel with these beets, since I shredded these really small, I can feel the liquid coming out already. And what you're going to start seeing as you mash is that you're going to start having a little puddle at the bottom of your bowl, and once you see that, you're probably ready to pack it into the jar. We're making an environment where certain types of bacteria can thrive, and the great thing about sauerkraut is how you can preserve this vegetable for the long term. And this isn't just sauerkraut, but this is any lactic acid fermentation, which you can do with pretty much any vegetable that has sugar in it, which is most vegetables. So if I had kept this cabbage on the counter, it probably would have stayed good for about 2 weeks, maybe. But this sauerkraut, once it's done, will be shelf stable basically indefinitely. So we have these lactobacillus or lactic acid bacteria, and what they're doing is they're consuming the sugars in the vegetables and converting it into lactic acid. And so once it's fermented for long enough, the sauerkraut has an appropriate acidity that basically makes it shelf stable. But what's also great about this is that you're taking this vegetable, which is, vegetables are good for us, I believe. I know there's a lot of carnivores out there that are trying to convince us otherwise. But one thing about cabbage is it's not the easiest to digest raw. I mean, no one really wants to eat that much raw cabbage. But what you're doing here is the bacteria are pre-digesting it for you and making it easier for your stomach to process. And in that process, they're actually increasing the amount of vitamins and minerals that you can get out of these vegetables when you eat them. So this bowl is looking pretty close. There's like a big puddle here, I think because of the beets. but this one I need to mash a little more. The other thing I'd want to say about sauerkraut is that you don't need all these fancy gadgets that I have in order to make it, like the food processor and the masher and the scale. The first time I made sauerkraut, I didn't have any of those things. The way I knew the weight of my cabbage was the receipt from the grocery store. And then I basically used volume to know the weight of my salt. Different salts have different densities, so I had to do a little Googling and convert the volume to a weight, but it still worked out. The percentage of salt doesn't need to be extremely accurate, but it's good to try to be accurate so that you get a passable result. The first time I tried to do like a lacto fermentation, or maybe this wasn't the first time, but one of them, I accidentally did a 20% salt. And so for one, nothing actually fermented because I don't think any bacteria could survive that. But also it tasted way too salty to eat. So if you want to know if your salt is at the right level, what you can do is just taste it. It should taste edible, but like a little more salty than you want it. The other thing you'll notice is that the volume went down a ton. This bowl was overflowing at the beginning, and now it fits comfortably in. So at this point, I might actually combine both my bowls. So I'm using these half-gallon jars. Should fill up maybe 1.5 of these, but you could do smaller jars if you want. Obviously you can't really buy half a cabbage, but if you just bought 1 cabbage, you would make maybe this, which is 2 quart jars. But what I'm gonna do here is just start shoving it all in. And at the beginning, the liquid isn't going to be covering the vegetables, but as you go further, just keep packing it down as you go. And that's where this is really helpful, to reach all the way to the bottom of the jar and have that packing force. Once I get to the top, the liquid is going to easily cover the vegetables, and that's where I'm going to add a fermentation weight. If you don't have fermentation weights, you can use a rock that you cleaned off. You can use a Ziploc bag full of water. That's not my favorite just because of the plastic. Or what you can do is use one of the outer leaves of the cabbage as like a sacrificial leaf. If you have anything that stays above the water level too long, it might start to grow mold, which you don't really want. I think for me, depending how bad it is, I might just remove it, knowing that the mold isn't able to grow under the water where most of my vegetables is, and it would just be sad to lose that whole batch. But if you're interested in sauerkraut and you have time on your hands, I say you should try it. It can be intimidating because, you know, you don't want to make something that gets you sick or waste all that time and effort, but it's really fulfilling and it's really a nutritious food. I mean, they sell sauerkraut at the grocery store, but it really can't get better than the stuff that you made yourself. It is pretty time intensive, and whenever I do this, it makes a huge mess of the kitchen. Like, there's cabbage on the floor right now. But it's gonna be worth it because this is gonna last me a few months. And I might do another batch of just, oh, and there's also cabbage beet juice on the walls right now. I might do another batch of just plain sauerkraut using the green cabbage. I like to have a couple options to choose from, and I will usually add this to almost anything I eat. It adds a pop of color, it adds a nice crunch and a nice tang. It's amazing. Okay, do you see that? I don't know if you can see from there. The liquid is just about covering it already. But the other thing that's interesting to me, so we're constantly surrounded in our environment, we're constantly surrounded with bacteria everywhere, on our hands, on our face, inside of our guts, all that kind of thing. So My theory is that when you make your own sauerkraut or make your own kombucha, you are actually inoculating it with the bacteria in your environment, like the types of bacteria that you deal with on a daily basis. And so I think there's a lot of things we don't quite yet understand about these microorganisms. And I think there's something to be said about that. Buying sauerkraut from a grocery store versus one that touched your hands and got all your bacteria all over it, right? So just a theory, but I think that there could be something beneficial to your health about making your own fermentations. So this jar is almost full. I don't want to overfill it because as the fermentation happens, the liquid can actually rise a little, and I just don't want it to spill out. Here's my fermentation weight. So I just lower this into the jar, keeps the liquid above the vegetables. The other thing, you do not want to put a sealed lid on this because it's going to be creating carbon dioxide gases. So I will usually use a cheesecloth or any piece of cloth with a rubber band that will keep any dust or bugs out of it, but allow the gases to escape. So there you go. That is ready right there. That's beautiful. If it's your first time, maybe try one cabbage so you don't have to do as much work. You can kind of feel a little hectic the first time you do it. So all you got to do, put this somewhere out of the way but where you can see it, because it's fun to watch and good to keep an eye on. Temperature down here is usually maybe like 65 degrees, which it will go faster in a warmer environment, but I think that'll be just fine. 65. Check on the top frequently just to make sure there's not vegetables floating. And if there is, push them under so before there's a chance for mold to grow on it. Check on the top. Check for bubbles. That's how you know it's working. Taste it every once in a while so you can tell when it's ready. And after about 30 days, you'll have some delicious sauerkraut. After it tastes how I want it to, I will usually move it to the fridge. Okay, there you go. Look at that. I'm so excited to eat this. That took me about 1.5 hours. If you put it in the cleanup, probably a solid 2 hours. All right, thank you for watching. If you stayed for this long, you really must be interested in sauerkraut, and that's really cool. If you aren't interested, I really think you should try it. It's so worth it. It's so delicious. It's so good for your health. It's so interesting to just watch it happen. It's so beautiful and colorful, and it opens you up to a whole world of what you can do with fermentation.